struggling cowboy found a wagon, then heard his dead mother's voice inside. Jake Thornton found his dead mother's music box in a blood-stained wagon, and when he opened it, her voice whispered his name from beyond the grave. The sun bled crimson across the salt flats, painting the desert floor the color of old wounds. Jake Thornton pulled his dying horse to a stop and squinted through the heat shimmer at what shouldn't have been there, a wagon, sitting alone in the vastness like a forgotten prayer. His stomach cramped with 3 days of hunger. The horse beneath him wheezed, ribs showing sharp as fence posts through matted hide. Jake's last dollar had bought whiskey instead of grain 2 towns back, and now both man and beast were paying the price of poor choices. The wagon sat maybe 200 yards off the trail, tilted at an odd angle where one wheel had sunk deep into the alkali earth. No horses in sight. No tracks leading away. Just silence stretching in every direction like God had forgotten this corner of creation. Jake dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a sound like bones breaking. The horse didn't even lift its head. He walked toward the wagon, each step raising small puffs of dust that caught the dying light and danced like spirits. As he drew closer, details emerged from the haze. Canvas torn and flapping in the desert wind. Dark stains along the wooden sides that looked suspiciously like dried blood. A smell that made his throat close, something sweet and rotten that spoke of death under the desert sun. But it was what he saw through the torn canvas that made him stop breathing. Silver, scattered across the wagon bed like fallen stars. Coins in small bars catching the last light, winking up at him with promises his empty belly understood better than his conscience ever could. Jake circled the wagon like a coyote approaching a carcass. His hand rested on the grip of his Colt, though what he expected to shoot in this emptiness, he couldn't say. The silence pressed against his ears until he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in the vastness. He climbed up onto the wagon bed, his weight making the whole thing creak like old bones. The smell hit him full force, death and desert heat, and something else, something familiar that made his chest tight. Among the scattered silver lay a small wooden box, carved with roses and painted in faded blues and golds. Jake's hands began to shake. He'd seen that box before, held it before, listened to its tinkling melody as his mother wound the tiny key and hummed along, her voice soft as cotton in the lamplight of their cabin. But his mother had been buried 5 years past, and her music box had gone into the ground with her. Jake had watched them lower the pine coffin into the hard Texas earth himself, had thrown the first handful of dirt onto the lid while tears carved clean tracks through the dust on his face. Yet here it sat, impossible as rain in hell. Jake's fingers trembled as he reached for the box. The moment his skin touched the carved wood, the desert wind died to nothing. The silence became absolute, pressing against him like a living thing. And then, soft as a whispered prayer, came the sound he'd been hearing in his dreams for 5 long years. His mother's voice, singing the lullaby she'd crooned when fever burned through him as a boy. "Hush now, my baby, the night's growing cold." Jake jerked his hand back as if the box had burned him. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. The voice faded, but the melody lingered in the still air, played by a music box that sat silent and closed. He looked around wildly, but the desert stretched empty in all directions. No place for anyone to hide. No explanation for what he'd heard except the one that made his skin crawl and his mouth go dry as old leather. The silver glinted up at him, patient as death. Enough wealth to buy a new horse, a new start, maybe even a little spread of his own somewhere the law didn't know his name. All he had to do was take it, fill his saddlebags, and ride away, leave the questions buried in the desert dust where they belonged. But as he reached for the first handful of coins, his mother's voice whispered again, so faint he might have imagined it. "Jake? Oh, Jake, what have you found?" The words carried a weight that had nothing to do with sound, sorrow and warning, and something that might have been fear. The coins felt cold in his palm despite the desert heat, and for a moment Jake could swear he smelled the earth of that Texas graveyard, rich and black and final. His horse nickered weakly from the trail, a sound that spoke of suffering and time running short. Jake looked from the silver to his dying mount, then back to the music box that shouldn't exist. His stomach cramped again, reminding him that noble thoughts didn't fill an empty belly or water a dying horse. The sun touched the horizon, bleeding the last light from the sky. In the gathering darkness, Jake made his choice. He filled his saddlebags with silver, the coins clinking together like whispered secrets. The music box he wrapped carefully in his spare shirt, though his hands shook each time he touched it. As he climbed down from the wagon, a desert wind rose from nowhere, carrying the scent of roses and something else, something that reminded him of Sunday mornings and his mother's gentle hands braiding his hair before church. Jake mounted his horse and turned back toward the trail, the weight of stolen silver heavy across the animal's back. Behind him, the empty wagon creaked in the wind, and somewhere in the darkness, he could swear he heard his mother weeping. The desert swallowed them both, man and beast, as night claimed the wasteland. But some sounds carry farther in darkness than they do in light, and all through that long, cold night, Jake Thornton rode with the echo of his mother's tears following close behind. The stolen silver bought him food and water, but every coin he spent whispered the name of its true owner, and his dead mother's voice grew louder with each mile. 3 days of riding had brought Jake Thornton no peace, only miles of dust and the weight of silver that seemed to grow heavier with each sunset. His horse, fed and watered with money that tasted of blood, moved with renewed strength beneath him, but Jake felt as though he were carrying the whole desert on his shoulders. The music box sat wrapped in his saddlebags, silent during the blazing days, but coming alive when darkness fell. Each night, as he made camp in the shelter of red rock formations or beneath the sparse shade of Joshua trees, the melody would begin. Soft at first, barely audible above the desert wind. Then stronger, clearer, until his mother's voice joined the tinkling notes. She never sang the whole lullaby anymore. Just fragments, broken pieces that cut deeper than any complete song ever could. The stars are watching, sweet boy. Mama's here, don't you fear. But the shadows know your name. The words weren't right. They weren't the lullaby he remembered from childhood fevers and thunderstorm nights. These words carried weight, carried knowledge of things that made Jake's skin crawl and his coffee taste like ashes in his mouth. On the second night, camped beside a dry creek bed that hadn't seen water since the spring floods, Jake had tried to bury the box beneath a pile of stones. But when he woke at dawn, it sat beside his bedroll, dew-covered and gleaming in the morning light. The silver coins, too, seemed to multiply in his bags. Every time he counted them, there were more, as if the desert itself was paying him wages for some job he didn't remember taking. By the third day, Jake could see smoke rising from cooking fires on the horizon. The town of Perdition squatted in a valley between two mesas like a scab on the earth's skin. It wasn't much to look at. Maybe 30 buildings, half of them false-fronted lies that promised more than they could deliver. But it had a saloon, a general store, and people who asked few questions about where a man's money came from. As Jake rode down the main street, his horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust that caught in the afternoon light, he felt eyes following his progress. A few men lounged on the saloon porch, their faces weathered as old leather and their eyes sharp as broken glass. Women peered from behind curtains, their expressions speaking of lives lived hard and hopes buried deep. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood at the town's heart, its bat-wing doors swinging gently in the desert breeze. Jake dismounted, tied his horse to the hitching post, and paused to listen. From inside came the familiar sounds of men drowning their troubles. Glasses clinking, cards shuffling, voices raised in laughter that didn't reach anyone's eyes. But underneath it all, so faint he might have imagined it, came the sound of his mother's music box, playing its haunted melody. Jake pushed through the doors and stepped into the saloon's amber-lit interior. The smell hit him immediately, whiskey and tobacco and unwashed bodies, but also something else. Something that reminded him of the wagon, of blood dried black under the desert sun. The bartender was a thick-set man with arms like tree trunks and scars that spoke of a life lived on the wrong side of trouble. He looked up as Jake approached, his eyes taking in the dust-covered clothes and the bulge of the saddlebags slung over Jake's shoulder. "Whiskey," Jake said, his voice hoarse from 3 days of talking to no one but ghosts. The bartender poured without comment, sliding the glass across the scarred wooden bar. Jake drank it in one swallow, feeling the burn trace a line of fire down his throat. It helped a little, made the world feel more solid, less likely to shift and change when he wasn't looking. "You're new," the bartender observed, refilling the glass without being asked. "Passing through. Most are these days." The man's eyes were careful, measuring. This country's got a way of wearing men down, taking things from them they didn't know they had to lose. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his saddlebags, with the silver coins pressed against his hip like guilty secrets. "What kind of things?" Before the bartender could answer, a commotion at the back of the saloon drew Jake's attention. A group of men had gathered around a poker table, their voices raised in argument. But it wasn't the men that made Jake's blood run cold. It was what he saw beyond them, sitting alone at a table in the corner. A girl, maybe 12 years old, with hollow eyes and clothes that hung on her thin frame like burial shrouds. She stared at nothing, her small hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Something about her face, about the set of her shoulders, reminded Jake of something he couldn't quite place. "Who's the girl?" he asked. The bartender's expression darkened. "Sarah Caldwell. Been sitting there for near 6 months now, ever since." He trailed off, but Jake could see the story written in the lines around the man's eyes. "Since what?" "Since her family got murdered on the trail north of here. Bandits hit their wagon train, took everything worth taking, and killed everyone worth killing. Girl was the only one left alive, and maybe that wasn't mercy." The bartender's voice dropped to a whisper. "Found her 3 days later, sitting beside the bodies like she was waiting for them to wake up." Jake's world tilted sideways. The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor in a spray of amber liquid and broken dreams. In his saddlebags, the music box began to play, not the soft, ghostly melody he'd grown accustomed to, but loud and clear, filling the saloon with its haunted song. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. And in the sudden silence, Jake heard his mother's voice, clear as church bells on Sunday morning. "Now you know, sweet boy. Now you know whose blood paid for your silver." Sarah Caldwell looked up from her cold coffee, and her hollow eyes met Jake's across the smoky saloon. In that gaze, Jake saw his own childhood reflected. The nights he'd waited by the window for a father who never came home. The mornings he'd woken to find his mother crying over bills they couldn't pay, the slow, grinding poverty that had shaped him into the kind of man who would steal from the dead. The music box played on, and somewhere in its melody, Jake could hear the echoes of another family's last moments, screams cut short, prayers left unfinished, a little girl's world ending in blood and desert dust. As the last notes faded into silence, Jake understood that some debts followed a man beyond the grave, and some ghosts refused to rest until the scales were balanced. The silver in his bags felt heavier than lead, and his mother's voice whispered one final warning that made his soul shrivel like paper in flame. "The dead know what you've done, Jake, and they're coming to collect." Jake stared into the orphaned girl's hollow eyes and saw his own damned soul reflected back, while his dead mother's voice begged him to choose salvation over survival. The silence in the Silver Dollar Saloon stretched like a hell breath. Jake stood frozen at the bar, the broken whiskey glass at his feet catching the lamplight like scattered tears. Every eye in the room had turned toward him when the music box began its ghostly song, but now the melody had faded, leaving only the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the tobacco-thick air. Sarah Caldwell's hollow gaze never left his face. She sat motionless as a carved saint, her small hands still wrapped around that cold cup of coffee, and Jake felt something crack open inside his chest, a place he'd kept sealed tight since the day they'd lowered his mother into the hard Texas earth. The bartender knelt to sweep up the broken glass, his movements careful and deliberate. You look like you've seen a ghost, stranger. Jake's laugh came out bitter as alkali water. Something like that. He forced his legs to carry him across the saloon floor, weaving between tables where men had returned to their cards and their whiskey, but kept stealing glances his way. Each step felt like walking through deep mud, and the silver in his saddlebags seemed to burn against his hip with the heat of a branding iron. Sarah didn't look up as he approached her table. Up close, Jake could see the true extent of what grief had done to her. She was thin as a rail, all sharp angles and hollow places, her dress hanging loose as a burial shroud. Her dark hair was clean but lank, and her skin held the translucent quality of someone who'd forgotten how to eat, how to sleep, how to live. But it was her eyes that nearly broke him. They held the same emptiness Jake had seen in his own reflection during the worst years. After his father disappeared into a bottle and never came back. After his mother worked herself to death, trying to keep food on their table. After he'd learned that sometimes the only choice was between stealing and starving. Mind if I sit? Jake asked quietly. Sarah's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment something flickered behind the emptiness. Curiosity, maybe, or just the automatic response of a child raised to be polite, even when the world had shown her no politeness in return. She nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. Jake pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly, his saddlebags sliding to the floor with a soft clink of silver coins that made him wince. The music box, wrapped in his spare shirt, seemed to pulse against his leg like a living heart. "I'm Jake," he said. "Sarah." Her voice came out as a whisper, rusty from disuse. "I heard about your family. I am sorry." Something passed across her face. Pain, anger, resignation. "Everyone's sorry. Don't make them any less dead." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He'd heard that same bitter wisdom in his own voice too many times to count. This girl had learned what he'd learned young, that the world was full of folks eager to offer sympathy, but precious few willing to offer real help. "How long you been sitting here?" Jake asked. "Since it happened." "Mrs. Patterson. She runs the boarding house. She gives me meals sometimes. Coffee when I can't sleep." Sarah's fingers tightened around the cup. "The men in town, they talk about finding the ones who did it. But talking's easier than tracking, and tracking's easier than justice." Jake's throat felt thick as desert sand. "What do they take?" "From your family's wagon, I mean." For the first time, real emotion flickered in Sarah's eyes. Anger, hot and fierce as a forge flame. "Everything. Every damn thing we owned. Papa's silver, the coins he'd saved up to buy land in California. Mama's jewelry. Even." Her voice broke, and she had to stop and gather herself. "Even my little brother's tin soldiers." "What kind of men steal toys from a dead child?" The words hit Jake like bullets, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. In his saddlebags, the silver coins seemed to grow heavier, and he could smell the phantom scent of blood on the desert wind. His mother's voice, when it came, was so faint only he could hear it. "Tell her, Jake. Tell her the truth." But the truth was a luxury Jake had never been able to afford. The truth was that he'd been hungry and desperate, that his horse had been dying, that he'd seen salvation sitting in an abandoned wagon and taken it without asking questions he didn't want answered. "Maybe they'll catch them," he said instead, the lie tasting like ashes in his mouth. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it, just the bitter knowledge of someone who'd learned too young that the world didn't work the way Sunday school teachers said it did. The sheriff rode out once, came back saying the trail was cold. "The preacher keeps saying God has a plan, but I figure if God's plan included watching my baby brother get shot down like a dog, then maybe God and I got different ideas about justice." The music box stirred against Jake's leg, and suddenly the saloon seemed too small, too hot, too full of eyes that might see too much. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I should go. Find a place to bed down for the night." Sarah looked up at him with those hollow eyes, and for a moment Jake thought she was going to say something else, something that might have changed everything. Instead, she just nodded and turned her attention back to her cold coffee. Jake made it halfway to the door before his mother's voice stopped him cold. "Look at her hands, Jake." He turned back, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sarah sat exactly as before, but now Jake could see what his mother wanted him to see. The girl's hands were small and delicate, but they bore calluses, the kind that came from hard work, from helping load wagons and tend horses and do all the things a family did when they were starting over in a new land. These were the hands that should have been holding his father's silver coins, not begging for scraps in a saloon full of strangers. "Sweet Jesus," Jake whispered, and the weight of what he'd done hit him like a rock slide. He'd stolen more than silver from that wagon. He'd stolen this girl's future, her chance at the life her parents had died trying to give her. Every coin in his bags was a piece of her family's dream, and he'd been spending those dreams on whiskey and horse feed while she sat in a corner, forgotten by everyone except the ghost that haunted her sleep. The saloon spun around him, and Jake had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. In his saddlebags, the music box began to play again. Not his mother's lullaby this time, but something else. Something that sounded like weeping, like prayers, like the last song a family might sing together before the darkness took them. As the melody faded, Jake heard his mother's voice one more time, clearer than it had been since that first night in the desert. "You know what you have to do, son. The only question is whether you're man enough to do it." Outside, the desert wind howled between the buildings, carrying the scent of sage and alkali and something that might have been redemption, if a man was brave enough to reach for it. Jake returned every stolen coin to the orphan girl, and as the last piece of silver touched her palm, his mother's ghost whispered goodbye and finally found a rest. Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed in the boarding house, staring at the saddlebags that held more weight than silver should carry. Outside his window, perdition slept the fitful sleep of a town built on broken dreams and borrowed time, but Jake's eyes remained fixed on the leather bags as if they might sprout wings and fly away if he looked elsewhere. The music box sat silent on the small wooden table, wrapped in his spare shirt like a corpse prepared for burial. But even in its stillness, Jake could feel its presence, a weight that pressed against his chest and made each breath feel like drowning. 3 times he'd reached for the bags. 3 times his mother's voice had whispered warnings that made his hands shake and his courage fail. But as the first pale light of dawn crept through the dusty window, Jake Thornton finally understood what his mother had been trying to tell him all along. Some debts could only be paid with the currency of a man's soul. He dressed slowly, his movements deliberate as a man walking to his own hanging. The silver coins clinked softly as he lifted the saddlebags, and for a moment he thought he heard other sounds mixed in with that metallic music. Children's laughter, a woman's gentle singing, a man's proud voice talking about California and new beginnings. The sounds of a family that would never reach their promised land. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood empty in the early morning light, its bat-winged doors hanging still as prayer hands. But the boarding house dining room held a few early risers, cowboys nursing hangovers with strong coffee, a traveling merchant counting his meager profits, and in the corner where she always sat, Sarah Caldwell. She looked smaller in the morning light, if such a thing were possible. Her dress was the same faded blue as yesterday, and her hair hung lank around a face that belonged on a child, but carried the weight of someone 3 times her age. The coffee cup sat before her, cold and untouched as always. Jake approached her table with steps that felt like walking through deep water. Each movement took effort, and the silver in his bags seemed to pull at him like chains. But his mother's voice, when it came, carried no desperation now, only a quiet strength that reminded him of Sunday mornings and clean clothes and the smell of biscuits in the oven. "This is why I couldn't rest, son. This is why I had to come back." Sarah looked up as Jake's shadow fell across her table. Her hollow eyes held no curiosity this time, no flicker of interest. She'd learned not to expect anything from the world, and the world had taught her that lesson well. "Morning," Jake said, his voice rough as sandpaper. She nodded but didn't speak. Jake pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. The saddlebags hit the floor with a sound like thunder, and several other diners turned to look. But Jake's attention was fixed on the girl before him. This child who should have been planning a new life in California instead of sitting in a saloon forgotten by everyone except the ghosts. I got something that belongs to you, Jake said. For the first time since he'd met her, real confusion crossed Sarah's face. I don't have anything left for anyone to give back. Jake's hands shook as he opened the saddlebags. The silver coins caught the morning light streaming through the windows, throwing scattered reflections across the rough wooden walls. He began placing them on the table between them, one at a time at first, then in small piles as his courage grew. Sarah's eyes widened as the pile grew larger. Her hands moved instinctively toward the coins, then stopped, hovering just above the silver as if she were afraid it might vanish like a desert mirage. "Where did you?" she began, but her voice died as recognition dawned in her eyes. These weren't just any coins. These were specific pieces, each one carrying the weight of memory and loss. "Papa's silver," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "These are Papa's coins. The ones he saved, the ones they took." Jake's throat felt thick as creek mud. "I found your family's wagon 3 days back, out on the salt flats, abandoned." The lie came easier than the truth, but it carried its own weight of shame. This was scattered inside. Sarah's small hands moved to cradle the coins, and Jake saw tears tracking down her thin cheeks. The first tears he'd seen her shed, as if the return of her family's treasure had finally given her permission to grieve. "There's more," Jake said, and reached for the music box. He unwrapped it slowly, his hands gentle as a man handling something sacred. The carved roses seemed to glow in the morning light, and the faded blue and gold paint looked exactly as he remembered from his childhood. But this wasn't his mother's music box. It never had been. This was Sarah's, a gift from parents who'd never see her grow into the woman she was meant to become. Sarah's breath caught as she saw it. Her hands flew to her mouth, and the tears came harder now, washing away months of accumulated dust and despair. "Mama's music box," she whispered through her fingers. She said it would keep me safe, that whenever I felt scared, I should wind it up and remember that love never really dies. Jake placed the box gently on the table beside the coins. As his fingers left the carved wood, something changed in the air around them. The morning light seemed brighter, cleaner somehow, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on Jake's chest for 3 days finally began to lift. Sarah wound the tiny key with trembling fingers, and the melody that emerged was nothing like the haunted song that had tormented Jake's nights. This was pure and sweet and full of hope. A mother's love made manifest in music, a father's dreams crystallized in silver, a family's future returned to the one soul left to carry it forward. As the last notes faded, Jake heard his mother's voice one final time. But now it carried no sorrow, no desperate pleading. Instead, it held the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, a debt finally paid. "Thank you, son. Now I can rest." The voice faded like smoke in the wind, and Jake knew with absolute certainty that he would never hear it again. His mother had found her peace at last, and the knowledge filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt since childhood. Sarah looked up at him with eyes that were no longer hollow. The tears had washed away some of the emptiness, and in its place Jake saw something that made his own eyes burn. Gratitude, yes, but also the first tentative stirrings of hope. "Why?" she asked simply. Jake considered his answer carefully. The truth was too complicated, too weighted with supernatural encounters and ghostly voices. Instead, he offered her something simpler, something she could understand without having to believe in things that defied explanation. "Because some things need to find their way home," he said. Sarah nodded, as if this made perfect sense. She gathered the coins carefully, counting them with the practiced movements of someone who'd helped her father with such tasks many times before. When she finished, she looked up at Jake with something approaching a smile. "It's enough," she said. "Enough to get to California, like Papa planned. Enough to buy a little piece of land and make something of myself. You gonna be all right? Traveling alone? Mrs. Patterson says there's a wagon train forming up in Tucson next month. Family's heading west. She thinks they might take me on if I can pay my way." Sarah's hands moved protectively over the coins. "Now I can. Jake stood slowly, feeling lighter than he had in years. The saddlebags hung empty at his side, but somehow their emptiness felt like fullness, like he'd finally carried something worthwhile instead of just the weight of his own survival. "I should go," he said. "Long trail ahead." Sarah stood as well, clutching the music box to her chest like a talisman. For a moment, they faced each other across the scarred wooden table. A broken cowboy and an orphaned girl, two souls who'd found something in each other that the world had tried to steal from them both. "Thank you," she said simply. Jake touched the brim of his hat and turned to go. But as he reached the door, Sarah's voice stopped him. "Mr. Jake." He turned back to see her standing in the shaft of morning sunlight, the music box in her hands, and hope beginning to bloom in her eyes like wildflowers after rain. I think my mama would have liked you." Jake's throat closed tight, and he had to look away before he could trust his voice to work. "I think mine would have liked you too, little darling. You take care of yourself out there." He walked out into the morning light with empty pockets and a heart fuller than it had been in years. Behind him, Sarah's music box began to play again, not the haunted melody that had tormented his nights, but the sweet, pure song of a love that death couldn't diminish and time couldn't steal. Jake mounted his horse and rode out of perdition as the sun climbed higher in the endless sky. The desert stretched before him, vast and unforgiving as always, but somehow it no longer seemed like an enemy. It was just the desert, beautiful in its harsh honesty, and he was just a man riding through it, no longer carrying the weight of stolen silver or the voices of the dead, but something far more precious. He was carrying the knowledge that sometimes, when the world gives you a choice between survival and salvation, the brave thing is to choose salvation and trust that survival will follow. And somewhere in a morning wind that stirred the sage and alkali, Jake could swear he heard his mother's voice one last time. Not warning or pleading now, but singing the lullaby he remembered from childhood, the one about stars watching over sleeping children and love that never dies. The desert swallowed the song as it had swallowed so many things, but this time Jake didn't feel lost in its vastness. This time, he felt like he was finally headed home,